They say that if you look at a bridge long enough, you start to see the way it breathes. As a senior structural inspector for the city of Chicago, I spent 30 years looking for the silent screams in steel and concrete. I could find a hairline fracture in a suspension cable from 50 yards away, and I knew exactly when a rivet was about to give up on its life's work. I was the man they called when the ground felt unstable, the guy who decided if a structure was fit to carry the weight of the world. But as I stood in my kitchen on that humid Tuesday afternoon, I realized now that I was the blindest man in Illinois. I could see the rot in a billion-dollar expressway, but I couldn't see the foundation of my own life turning into wet sand right beneath my feet. The kitchen smelled of honey-glazed chicken and the sharp, clinical tang of rubbing alcohol. It was a scent that had defined my existence for the last 7 years. Ever since Margaret's kidneys began to fail, our home hadn't really been a home. It was a private ward, a sterile cage where the clocks were set by pill schedules and dialysis appointments. I moved with a mechanical, practiced precision, slicing the poultry into uniform, low-sodium strips. I was 62 years old, a man built of iron and discipline, but the constant weight of caregiving had given me a permanent slouch, a caregiver's lean that felt like a slow-motion collapse of my own spine. I checked the wall clock. Numb. Murlampi. Margaret was supposed to be at Memorial Grace Hospital, tethered to a machine that hummed while it filtered the toxins from her blood. I had dropped her off at the curb 4 hours ago, watching her frail frame lean heavily on her cane as she disappeared through the sliding glass doors. I remember the way she looked back at me, her eyes watery and full of a quiet, tragic gratitude that always made me feel like a hero. I'd traded the Chicago skyline, the bridges I loved, the career that defined me for the fragile architecture of a dying woman's hope. I'd resigned from the DOT 3 years early because she needed me. I thought that was what a man did. I thought sacrifice was the ultimate rivet that held a marriage together. I didn't know it yet, but the woman I was preparing dinner for was currently sitting in a velvet chair 20 miles away, laughing over a glass of champagne I hadn't paid for. The vibration started as a low thrum against the butcher block. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just the refrigerator compressor cycling on. Then the kitchen phone began to rattle with a persistent, cold urgency. I wiped my hands on my apron, the familiar weight of my heavy chef's knife reassuring in my palm as I set it down. The caller ID flashed, Silverstone Trust and Investments. My pulse quickened. This was the bank handling my late father's legacy trust, a probate process that had been dragging on for 18 grueling months. My father had been a man of old-school wealth, a contractor who built half the South Side, and his estate was the only thing standing between us and total financial ruin. The medical bills had already eaten through my pension like acid through rebar. I picked up, expecting a dry update from a bored clerk. Instead, the voice on the other end was Daniel, a junior associate I'd dealt with a few times. He sounded like he was trying to scream through a mouthful of cotton. "Mr. Pierce, Mitchell, it's Daniel, from the bank," he stammered, his voice dropping to a frantic, terrified whisper. "I'm breaking every security protocol in the book by calling your personal cell, but, God, Mitchell, you need to listen to me." "Daniel, slow down," I said, leaning against the counter. A strange chill was crawling up my neck, the kind of instinctual warning I used to get right before a support beam snapped. "Is the probate cleared? Did the final documents go through?" "That's the thing, Mitchell," Daniel hissed, and I could hear the sound of his heavy breathing over the line. "The documents are being signed. Right now. I'm looking through the glass of the VIP suite. Your wife is here, Mitchell. Margaret is sitting right there, looking healthier than I've ever seen her." I felt a sharp spike of irritation. "That's impossible, Daniel. Margaret is at Memorial Grace. She's mid-dialysis. I literally watched her walk into the hospital." "Mitchell, listen to me very carefully," Daniel whispered, and the sheer terror in his tone made the knife on the counter seem to shimmer. "She isn't alone. She's sitting with you. Or, she's sitting with a man who has your face. He's wearing your charcoal suit, the one with the silk lapels. He has your silver hair, your glasses. He's even wearing that gold Duke commemorative watch you always bragged about. He's signing your legal name on the final legacy trust documents. He's taking the entire $12 million inheritance. Mitchell, he's erasing you." The knife hit the floor. The blade sang against the tile, a perfect, resonant fracture. I stared at the shimmering steel by my feet, my brain refusing to process the data. I was standing in my kitchen in a flour-stained apron, But according to the bank, I was also 20 miles away, stealing my own life. "I'm standing in my kitchen, Daniel," I shouted into the phone, my voice cracking with a sudden, raw anger. "I'm right here." "Then you have 12 minutes, Daniel hissed, the sound of paper rustling audible over the line. "The notary is checking the ID. If you aren't here in 12 minutes to prove who you are, the money is gone, the trust is closed, and on paper, you're a dead man. Mitchell, if you don't get here, you don't exist anymore." The garage door groaned open like a heavy tomb, and I didn't wait for it to clear the roof of my truck before I slammed the gear into reverse. My knuckles were already white against the steering wheel. As I cleared the driveway, the smell of burning rubber and hot engine oil filled the cabin, a sharp contrast to the honeyed warmth of the kitchen I had just abandoned. I swung the truck onto the main road, weaving through the aggressive late-afternoon Chicago traffic with a recklessness that would have horrified the man I was 20 minutes ago. Every red light felt like a personal insult, a crimson barrier designed to strip away the life I had meticulously built. As I pushed the engine to its limit, the roar of the truck felt like a cathartic release for the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Time wasn't a river anymore. It was a noose tightening around the neck of my father's legacy. Then, the first crack in the memory appeared. I began to realize with a sickening clarity, the kind that usually only comes after a bridge collapse, that Margaret's flares always happened at the most convenient times. Every time I had a major project promotion, she had a kidney crisis. Every time I was due for a site inspection that would take me out of town, she ended up in the ER. 7 years of systematic career sabotage flashed before my eyes as I narrowly missed a delivery van. I had been an engineer of steel and concrete, but I had been blind to the rot in my own living room. I had walked away from the best engineering mind in the state because I believed my presence at home was the only thing keeping her alive. Now, I saw the truth through the windshield of a speeding truck. I hadn't been a savior. I had been a prisoner. I screeched into the parking lot of Silverstone Trust and Investments, the tires screaming as I bypassed the main entrance. I spotted it immediately. Margaret's dark green BMW, a car I'd bought her for her 50th birthday, was parked crookedly near the VIP entrance. The glint of the setting sun off the paint was blinding. "You weren't at the hospital, were you?" I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I jumped out of the truck, my boots hitting the asphalt hard. As I ran past the BMW, I glanced through the rear window. There, tucked half under the driver's seat, was something that made my heart stop. It was a professional-grade makeup kit, the kind they use on movie sets. Silicone adhesives, flesh-toned palettes, and prosthetic molds spilled across the floor mat. The man inside wasn't just a look-alike. He was a carefully manufactured double. I saw Daniel standing at the side employee entrance, his face as pale as a sheet, frantically waving me toward the shadow of the corridor. The transition from the roar of Chicago traffic to the sterile, carpeted silence of the bank felt like entering a vacuum where the oxygen was being replaced by ice. Daniel grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my jacket. "He sounds like you, Mitchell," he murmured, his voice trembling as we bypassed a cluster of tellers. "He moves like you. He even has that slight hitch in his shoulder from your old injury. But the eyes are too hungry." "I'm right here, Daniel," I replied, my voice sounding hollow in the air-conditioned void. "I've been here for 62 years. Whoever is in that room is a phantom." We entered a small, cramped room dominated by a wall of monitors casting a blue, flickering light over our faces. Daniel didn't speak. He just reached for the console and hit a command. Monitor bone flickered, the grainy texture of the security feed smoothing out to show the interior of Conference Room A. I felt the ground vanish. I watched in absolute paralyzed horror as my wife, Margaret, the woman who supposedly couldn't walk 10 feet without gasping for air, sat tall and elegant in a leather chair. She wasn't pale. She wasn't shaking. She was glowing. She sat there laughing casually, drinking bottled water while chatting with a man who sat in the chair next to her. The man wore my charcoal suit. He had my glasses perched on his nose. He even wore my father's gold wedding band. He leaned in and whispered something into Margaret's ear, and she threw her head back in a silent, genuine laugh, a laugh I hadn't heard in a decade. Then I saw the man reach out and pick up the heavy fountain pen. He hovered it over the final page of the trust. My father's signature line. My life's inheritance. I leaned so close to the monitor that the pixels blurred into a jagged mosaic. That was when I noticed the man's hand. As he prepared to sign, he adjusted his cufflink with a very specific, nervous twitch of the pinky finger. It was a twitch I didn't have, but I knew exactly who did. I felt the industrial rage finally crystallize in my chest. I turned to Daniel, my voice a low, dangerous rasp. That's not just a stranger, Daniel. I know who that is. Before I could say another word, the man on the screen turned his head slightly toward the camera, and for a split second the light hit his prosthetic mask just right, revealing the faint, jagged scar beneath the silicone on his neck. I didn't know it yet, but my wife hadn't just hired an actor. She had hired the one man I thought I'd sent to prison 10 years ago, and he wasn't just here for the money. He was here to finish what he started. I stood in the flickering blue dark of the security room, my breath hitching as I watched the man on the monitor adjust my father's gold watch. The scar on his neck, a jagged, silver line hidden beneath professional-grade silicone, was a ghost from a past I had tried to forget. I knew that scar. I'd seen it 10 years ago when I testified as the lead inspector against a demolition crew that had taken lethal shortcuts on the Old Bay Bridge project. Ryan Blackwood. He hadn't been a stuntman then. He'd been a reckless Site 4-man whose negligence almost cost 20 men their lives. I was the one who put him in a jumpsuit. Now he was wearing mine. "Mitchell, your hand is bleeding," Daniel whispered, pointing down. I looked down at my fist. I was gripping the edge of the security console so hard the metal casing had sliced into my palm. I didn't even feel it. My nervous system was currently being rewired by the realization that my entire domestic life had been a choreographed stage play. How does a man, an engineer trained to spot the smallest structural anomaly, miss a decade-long conspiracy in his own bedroom? The answer is simple. You don't look for cracks in a foundation you believe is sacred. You don't inspect a heart you think beats for you. I leaned back, the memories of the last 7 years beginning to reorder themselves with a sickening, mechanical logic. It started with a phone call 7 years ago, the day the first collapse happened. I was on site at the Wacker Drive expansion, hanging 40 feet over the Chicago River, when my phone screamed. It was my daughter, Claire. She was hysterical, her voice a jagged edge of panic. "Dad, Mom's on the floor. She can't breathe. Her kidneys. The doctors are saying they're failing." I remembered the sheer, paralyzing terror of that drive to the hospital. I remembered the way Margaret looked in that white bed, pale, trembling, her skin a ghostly yellow. I remember the doctor, a man named Harrison with a soft voice and eyes that never quite met mine, explaining the rare degenerative condition that required constant, around-the-clock care. "I'll fix it," I had whispered to her as I held her hand. "I'm an inspector, Maggie. I fix things. I won't let you fall." That was the moment I became a prisoner. I didn't know it yet, but that hospital room was the first room of my jail. To an engineer, a problem requires a solution. I threw my entire life into the solution of Margaret. I took a voluntary retirement that was essentially a career suicide. I cashed in my Bon Chum Lermach to buy specialized medical equipment. I transformed our home into a sterile annex of a hospital ward. I didn't know it then, but every time I adjusted her pillows, every time I meticulously measured her low-sodium broth, I was just reinforcing the bars of my own cage. I watched the screen as Margaret reached over and stroked Ryan's hand. The intimacy was effortless. It was a touch of genuine warmth she hadn't shown me in years. For the last half-decade, our bedroom had been a sick room. We didn't touch. We managed symptoms. We didn't talk. We discussed vitals. I had been relegated to the role of a high-end, unpaid nurse, while she was apparently living a second life in the shadows. "Look at her face, Mitchell," Daniel said, his voice full of a pity that tasted like bile. "Does she look like a woman who needs a transplant? She's vibrant. She's glowing." He was right. On the grainy monitor, Margaret looked 10 years younger. She was wearing a dress I'd never seen, a silk navy piece that cost more than a month of her medication. She was laughing at something Ryan said. A memory hit me then, a sharp, cold rivet of truth. 5 years ago, my son Ethan, my only son, had come to me with concerns. He'd always been an observant kid, a chip off the old block. He'd told me something felt off about the way Claire was handling the medical bills. He'd said, "Dad, I saw Mom in the city yesterday. She wasn't in a wheelchair. She was walking into a boutique on Michigan Avenue. I had been so deep in the hero role, so invested in my own nobility, that I'd turned on him. I'd shouted at him, called him ungrateful, and told him his mother was dying while he was playing detective. I'd essentially exiled my own son to New York to protect a lie I didn't even know I was living. I hadn't spoken to Ethan in 3 years. She used my pride against me, I whispered to the blue room. She knew I wouldn't question the burden if I thought I was the only one who could carry it. The architecture of the betrayal was breathtaking. It wasn't just Margaret. It was Claire, my daughter, the person I'd walked down the aisle, the person I'd funded through law school. Claire was the one who had introduced us to Dr. Harrison. Claire was the one who managed the anonymous medical portals where I uploaded my reports. Claire hadn't just watched her mother fake a death. She had been the director of the entire production. "They're moving to the final signature," Daniel warned, his finger tapping the monitor. "The notary is pulling out the seal." I watched as the notary, a woman in her 30s with a sharp bob, started flipping through the massive stack of probate documents. She looked familiar. I squinted at the screen. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. "I know her," I said. "That's Sarah Vane. She was Claire's roommate in law school. She's not a bank notary. She's a plant." This wasn't just a heist. It was a total demolition. They weren't just stealing my father's money. They were using a fraudulent notary to ensure the documents looked ironclad to the state. Once that seal hit the paper, the trust would be dissolved. The money would be wired to an offshore account, and I would be left in a house full of empty pill bottles, and a wife who would miraculously recover just long enough to divorce a penniless man. I felt the old Mitchell Pierce, the senior inspector who once shut down a $40 million project because a single weld was off, start to wake up. The slouch in my shoulders vanished. The fog of caregiving exhaustion evaporated, replaced by a cold, industrial clarity. "Daniel," I said, my voice as steady as a concrete pylon, "does this bank have a secondary authentication protocol for legacy trusts over $5 million? Daniel blinked. "Yeah, but it requires a physical engineering seal or a verified government credential. It's a poison pill clause your father put in. He didn't trust the bank's digital security." I reached into my pocket. My fingers brushed against the heavy, cold steel of my official DOT inspector's seal. It was the only thing I'd kept when I resigned. I'd carried it like a talisman, a reminder of the man I used to be. "He doesn't have it," I whispered, watching Ryan on the screen. "Ryan has the suit, the watch, and the face, but he doesn't have the seal, and he doesn't have the inspector." I turned to leave the security room, but Daniel grabbed my sleeve. "Mitchell, wait. You can't just storm in there. If they see you, they'll pivot. They'll claim you're the imposter. They've been building this lie for 7 years. People will believe them before they believe a grieving, unstable husband." I looked at the monitor one last time. Margaret was leaning in, whispering something into the ear of the man who had stolen my face. She looked so happy, so free. "You're right," I said, a dark, jagged plan beginning to take shape in my mind. "A bridge doesn't fall because you hit it with a hammer. It falls because you remove the one rivet that's holding the tension." I didn't run for the conference room. Instead, I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 years. My hand was shaking, but my voice was iron. "Ethan," I said when the line picked up, "it's Dad. I need you to listen to me, and I need you to not hang up. The bridge is coming down, son, and I need you to help me catch the debris." As I spoke, I watched the monitor. The notary, Sarah Vane, raised the heavy silver seal. She was smiling. In 10 seconds, the life I knew would be legally over. But as the seal descended, the lights in the conference room didn't just flicker. They died. Quote, "And one," end quote. The less of line. I didn't know it yet, but I wasn't the only one who had been watching Margaret and Ryan. Behind the glass, in the shadows of the VIP lounge, another figure was moving. Someone who had been waiting even longer than I had for this moment. "What happened?" Daniel gasped, frantically hitting keys on the console. The entire floor just went into a hard security lockdown. "Mitchell, what did you do?" "I didn't do that," I said, my eyes fixed on the black screen of monitor bone. What happened next changed everything, because through the pitch-black silence of the bank, I heard something that shouldn't have been possible. I heard the sound of my own voice, not coming from the man in the room, but coming from the bank's intercom system. Mitchell Pierce has left the building, the voice said. It's time to see what's left of the foundation. My blood turned to ice. That wasn't Ryan's voice. It wasn't mine. It was a digital ghost. The darkness in the security room was thick, smelling of ionized air and the frantic, sour sweat of a man who realized he was a witness to a felony. Daniel's hands were a blur of motion over the keyboard, but the monitors remained stubbornly black, save for a single blinking cursor in the corner of monitor bone. That voice, that digital, hollowed-out version of my own soul, vibrated in the ceiling tiles, leaving a cold trail of static in its wake. Mitchell, I can't override it, Daniel hissed, his voice cracking. Someone didn't just pull the breaker. They've uploaded a logic bomb into the bank's internal grid. The security doors are magnetically locked. Conference room A is a vacuum right now. I didn't answer. My focus was on the phone pressed to my ear. On the other end, 3 years of silence were being shredded by my son's ragged breathing. Dad, are you still there? Ethan's voice was a lifeline, but it was frayed. I heard the intercom. I'm in the parking lot, Dad. I've been sitting in a rented sedan across the street for 3 hours. I saw them go in. I saw the guy in your suit. The ground felt like it was shifting. You're here, in Chicago? Ethan, why didn't you call me? Because I didn't think you'd believe me, he shouted, and the raw hurt in his voice was a structural failure I'd caused years ago. Every time I tried to tell you Mom was faking, you treated me like a criminal. You chose her lie over your own son, Dad. But I couldn't just let them do this. I've been tracking Claire's bank movements for months. She's been funneling money to a shell company called Mimicry Arts. I thought it was just a scam, until I saw that man today. He looks exactly like you, Dad. It's sickening. I closed my eyes, leaning my forehead against the cold glass of the security partition. I had built a career on the idea that things only fall apart when you ignore the warning signs. I'd ignored every siren, every crack, every groaning rivet in my own family because I wanted to be the good man. I wanted the nobility of the sacrifice. I had been so busy being a martyr that I forgot to be a father. Ethan, listen to me, I said, my voice dropping to a low, industrial hum. The bank is in lockdown. I'm inside the security hub. Who is the digital voice? Who hacked the intercom? That wasn't me, Dad, Ethan said, and I felt a new kind of cold settle into my marrow. I'm just a guy with a laptop in a rental car, but someone else is in the system. Someone much faster than me. There's a second signal coming from inside the building. A ghost signal. I looked at Daniel. He was staring at the blinking cursor on the screen. The cursor began to move, typing out words in a stark, white font that looked like a death warrant. Phase by. Asset liquidation. Primary target. Mitchell Pierce. What the hell is Phase Bay? Daniel whispered. I didn't know it yet, but Phase Bay wasn't just about the money. It was about the biological removal of the man whose name was on the account. They didn't just want the inheritance. They wanted the death certificate to match the signature. Daniel, get the emergency flashlight. We're going to the lobby, I commanded. I didn't wait for him. I pushed through the heavy security door, stepping out into the back corridor. The emergency lights were dim, casting long, skeletal shadows against the marble walls. The bank, usually a place of sterile order, now felt like a mausoleum. I moved with the stealth of a man who knew exactly where the load-bearing walls were, my heart hammering a rhythmic, frantic beat against my ribs. As I rounded the corner toward the main lobby, I heard the faint, rhythmic clack-clack-clack of a cane. I froze, pressing myself into the shadows of a velvet-draped pillar. The sound was coming from the lobby, the sound of Margaret's frailty. It was the sound that had ruled my life for 7 years. The sound that usually prompted me to rush to her side with a glass of water or a steadying arm. But then, the sound stopped. You can drop the act, Mother. The cameras are dead. A sharp, familiar voice rang out. Claire, my daughter, the girl I'd taught to ride a bike on the very streets she was now using to bury me. I peered around the pillar. In the dim amber glow of the emergency exit signs, I saw them. Margaret was standing in the center of the lobby, but she wasn't leaning on her cane. She was holding it like a swagger stick, her posture as straight and rigid as a steel girder. Her face, which I had spent years watching for signs of pain, was a mask of cold, calculating ambition. Claire stood opposite her, tapping her phone screen with an agitated thumb. Beside them stood the man in my suit, Ryan Blackwood. He had pulled the silicone mask back slightly from his chin, revealing the sweaty, desperate face of the man I had once helped put in prison. "Sarah says the notary seal is blocked," Claire snapped, her voice echoing in the empty space. "The system is demanding a secondary inspector seal. Why didn't you tell me the old man kept his physical stamp?" Margaret let out a short, dry laugh, a sound that made my skin crawl. "Mitchell is a sentimental fool, Claire. He clings to that job because it's the only thing that ever made him feel powerful. I told you we should have taken the stamp from his bedside table months ago." "It doesn't matter," Ryan muttered, his voice a gravelly imitation of my own. "We have the power of attorney. If the digital system is locked, we take the physical documents and the backup notary to the North Side branch. We've already got the van waiting." "And what about Mitchell?" Margaret asked, her voice dropping to a level of coldness I didn't think she was capable of. "He's probably at the hospital by now, realizing I'm not there. He's smarter than you give him credit for, Claire. He's an inspector. He's going to find the cracks." Claire looked at her mother, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. "Don't worry about Dad. Dr. Harrison already adjusted the medication schedule. If he went back home to check on you, he's probably already feeling the first stage of the respiratory depressant. By the time he realizes what's happening, his heart will be too tired to care." I felt a surge of nausea so violent I had to grip the pillar to keep from collapsing. The vitamins I had been giving her, the herbal teas I'd brewed with such love, they hadn't been for her. They had been for me. For 7 years, I hadn't been nursing a sick wife. I had been slowly poisoning myself, under the direction of my own daughter. Every time I felt caregiver's fatigue, every time my lungs felt heavy and my head felt cloudy, it wasn't the stress. It was the dose. I was the one who was dying, and I had been the one administering the slow-motion execution. The betrayal was so absolute, so structurally perfect, that for a moment I felt the urge to just step out into the light and let them finish it. If the world was this corrupt, why bother standing? But then, the vintage flip phone in my pocket, the one Daniel had handed me as a backup, vibrated. A text message from a number I didn't recognize. "Look at the floor, Mitchell. Follow the red light." I looked down. A tiny pinprick laser dot was dancing on the marble floor near my boots. It wasn't coming from the security room. It was coming from the ventilation duct above the VIP suite. I looked up and saw a small, blackened camera lens I hadn't noticed before. Someone else was in the building. Someone who wasn't a ghost. "Mitchell," a new voice whispered, not through a phone, but from a small, hidden speaker in the pillar behind me. I jumped, spinning around. It was a man's voice, smooth, clinical, and vaguely familiar. "My name is Samuel Torres," the voice said. "I'm a private investigator, and I've been on your daughter's payroll for 2 years. But Claire Pierce has a habit of not paying her subcontractors, and I don't like being left in the cold. What do you want?" I hissed into the shadows. "I want the same thing you do," Torres replied. "I want to see the bridge collapse. But you have to move now, Mitchell." Ryan is reaching for his coat pocket. He's not just carrying a pen. I look back at the lobby. Ryan Blackwood was indeed reaching into the internal pocket of my charcoal suit, but he didn't pull out a document. He pulled out a small, snub-nosed revolver. "The van is here," Ryan said, nodding toward the glass front doors. "Let's get the signatures at the safe house. We don't need the bank's permission if we have the physical notarized deeds." "Wait," Margaret said, her head snapping toward the corridor where I was hiding. "Did you hear that?" The silence that followed was the most terrifying thing I'd ever experienced. My lungs felt like they were filled with lead. The respiratory depressant Claire mentioned was starting to itch at the back of my throat. My vision blurred for a second, the emergency lights turning into weeping halos. I had no weapon. I had no backup inside the building. I was a 62-year-old man who had been slowly poisoned for years, standing in the dark against a man with my face and a gun. "Check the hallway, Ryan," Claire commanded, her voice devoid of any familial warmth. "If someone's here, we can't leave witnesses. Phase Bay, remember? Total liquidation." I heard the heavy, rhythmic footfalls of Ryan Blackwood, my own footsteps, mirrored back at me approaching the pillar. Thud, thud, thud. I reached into my pocket and gripped my engineering seal. It was a heavy, solid piece of industrial steel with sharp, raised edges. It wasn't a gun, but it was the only piece of truth I had left. As Ryan rounded the corner, the light from the exit sign glinting off the barrel of his revolver, I didn't retreat. I stepped forward into the dim light, my shoulders square, the inspector finally facing the fraud. "You're wearing my suit, Ryan," I said, my voice sounding like grinding stone. "But you're standing on a bridge you didn't build, and you're about to find out what happens when the load exceeds the limit." Ryan froze, his eyes widening as he stared at the man he had spent months mimicking. For a second, it was like looking into a haunted mirror. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, a sudden, deafening roar shattered the glass front doors of the bank. A black SUV slammed through the lobby, sending a spray of reinforced glass over Margaret and Claire. "Dad, get down." It was Ethan. But as I dove for the floor, I saw Margaret. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small, remote-controlled detonator. "If I can't have the legacy," she screamed over the sound of the car alarm, "nobody gets the foundation." She didn't press the button. She looked directly at me, her eyes full of a madness that had been brewing for 7 years. "I never loved the bridge, Mitchell," she hissed. "I just loved watching you try to hold it up." Then she clicked the switch. The floor didn't explode. Instead, the heavy fire suppression shutters of the bank began to slam down, sealing the lobby into a steel-plated box. But they weren't just sealing us in. I heard the hiss of gas, not fire suppressant, but something that smelled sweet, like almonds. "Nitrogen," I gasped, the engineering brain in me calculating the oxygen displacement in seconds. We were in a sealed tomb, and the air was disappearing. What happened next changed the nature of the betrayal entirely, because as the gas filled the room, Claire turned to her mother with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. "Mom, what are you doing? I'm still in here." Margaret didn't look at her daughter. She was staring at a small, hidden panel in the floor that I'd never noticed, a private escape hatch for the VIP clients. "There was only ever room for one survivor in this design, Claire," Margaret said, her voice calm and terrifying. "You taught me that." I watched as my wife, the woman I'd sacrificed everything for, stepped toward the hatch, leaving her own daughter to suffocate in the dark. I didn't know it yet, but the true architect of my ruin wasn't the one I expected. The sweetness of the air was a lie, much like the woman who had just activated the vents. In the world of structural engineering, we're taught that the most dangerous gases are the ones you can't see, smell, or taste. But Margaret had always had a flair for the theatrical. The almond-scented vapor, likely a nitrogen mix designed to displace oxygen in seconds, hissed from the ornate brass grates near the ceiling. It was a high-end execution, a clean removal for a clean bank. My lungs felt like they were being lined with lead. Every breath was a labor, a heavy, dragging effort that made the room tilt on its axis. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the sound of Claire's voice. My daughter, the woman who had spent the last year orchestrating my slow-motion burial, was currently screaming at the mother who had just left her to die. "Mom, open the hatch!" "Margaret." Claire's fingernails scraped against the heavy floor plate where my wife, no, the stranger I lived with, had just disappeared. Margaret didn't answer. The heavy metallic clunk of a deadbolt sliding into place beneath the floorboards was her only reply. It was the sound of a final divorce, not just from me, but from the very child she had raised to be a monster in her own image. I watched Claire's face crumble, the cold, boardroom-ready mask dissolving into the raw, terrified features of a little girl who realized she'd been out-hustled by her own idol. Have you ever seen the exact moment a predator realizes it's been turned into prey? It's not a pretty sight. It's a collapse of the spirit that's more violent than any bridge failure I'd ever inspected. "Dad, get in the truck now." Ethan's voice was muffled by the reinforced glass of the SUV, but the urgency was a physical force. He was still in the driver's seat of the black rental he'd used to ram the front entrance. The engine was roaring, the tires spinning on the slick marble floor as he tried to back the vehicle toward the center of the lobby. He hadn't just come to watch. He had come to be the demolition crew. I tried to move, but my legs felt like they belonged to someone else. The medication, Claire had mentioned the respiratory depressant I'd been feeding myself under her direction, was synergizing with the thinning air. My heart was a drum, beating a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs, thump thump, skip, thump. I was a 62-year-old man with a compromised heart and no oxygen. I shouldn't have been able to stand, let alone fight. But an inspector doesn't stop just because the scaffolding starts to shake. I looked at Ryan Blackwood. He was still holding the revolver, but his hand was shaking so badly the barrel was tracing erratic circles in the air. He was gasping, his face turning a mottled, bruised purple as the nitrogen displaced the oxygen. He looked at me, and for a second, the man who had stolen my face looked like a drowning man staring at the shore. "Mitchell, please," he wheezed, the gravelly imitation of my voice failing him. "The codes, the transfer. You're wearing the wrong suit for a funeral, Ryan," I rasped, my voice sounding like it was being dragged over broken glass. I didn't go for the gun. I knew that in a sealed room with no air, a gunshot was a death sentence for everyone. The shockwave alone would rupture our eardrums in the pressurized environment. Instead, I reached into my coat and pulled out the heavy, steel dot seal. It was 4 pounds of industrial-grade metal, a solid block of history. I didn't hit him. I threw it. I spent my youth as a pitcher for a minor league team in Gary, Indiana, before the engineering bug bit me. The mechanics of a throw are just like the mechanics of a bridge. It's all about the transfer of energy through a pivot point. The seal caught Ryan square in the temple. It wasn't a killing blow, but it was enough to send him reeling into the heavy mahogany desk where the notary, Sarah Vane, was currently huddled in a fetal position. The gun clattered across the floor, sliding into the darkness beneath a velvet sofa. "Ethan, the SUV," I shouted, the effort making black spots dance in my vision. "Break the HVAC seal, the primary intake is behind the teller wall." Ethan didn't hesitate. He slammed the SUV into gear, the tires smoking as he lurched the heavy vehicle forward. He wasn't aiming for the doors anymore. He was aiming for the structural pillars that housed the ventilation controls. The sound of the impact was a deafening, metallic crunch that vibrated through the floorboards. Dust and plaster rained down from the ceiling. For a second, the hissing of the gas stopped, replaced by the mechanical groan of a system under immense stress. But the shutters were still down. The tomb was still sealed. I felt a hand grab my arm. It was Claire. She was pale, her eyes bloodshot, her breathing shallow and frantic. "Dad, please," she whispered, her voice stripped of all its arrogance. I didn't know she'd leave me. I was just trying to get the money for us. For our future. "Our future?" I asked, looking at the daughter I'd once rocked to sleep. "You were poisoning me, Claire. You were measuring my life in milligrams." "It was just to keep you quiet," she cried, a desperate, pathetic lie. "To keep you from seeing the truth until we could get away. Mom said you'd understand. She said you loved being the martyr." I looked at her, and for the first time in 62 years, I felt a total, clinical detachment. I didn't hate her. I didn't love her. I simply saw her as a faulty design, a structure that had been built with flawed materials from the very beginning. "The thing about martyrs, Claire," I said, leaning in so she could see the iron in my eyes through the haze of the gas, "is that they eventually die, and I'm not ready to be a memory just yet." I pushed her off me and staggered toward the teller wall. My mind was racing, calculating the layout of the bank. I'd inspected this building's renovation 5 years ago. I knew that behind the main vault, there was a secondary manual release for the fire shutters, a fail-safe required by city code for high-occupancy financial institutions. But I couldn't get to the vault. The nitrogen was too thick there, pooling in the lower elevations of the lobby like a heavy, invisible lake. "Dad, the air." Ethan was out of the car now, holding a wet rag over his face. He grabbed my shoulder, trying to pull me toward the SUV. "We can breathe inside the cabin for a few minutes. The seals are better." "No time," I wheezed. "The manual release. It's behind the teller station. 3rd drawer from the left. There's a hidden lever." I didn't wait for him to respond. I dove over the marble counter, my body hitting the wooden floor on the other side with a jarring impact. The air was thinner here, colder. I felt the first signs of hypoxia, the strange, euphoric lightheadedness that precedes a total blackout. I found the drawer. I ripped it open, throwing bundles of cash and deposit slips onto the floor. My fingers fumbled against the back of the cabinet, searching for the recessed latch. Click. The back panel slid away, revealing a heavy, red-painted iron lever. It was rusted, frozen in place by years of neglect. I grabbed it with both hands, my muscles screaming, my lungs burning for oxygen that wasn't there. "Come on, you bastard mauve." I put every ounce of my 62 years into that pull. I thought about the 7 years of tea. I thought about the missed holidays. I thought about the son I'd exiled and the father whose legacy was being used as a weapon. The lever groaned. Scree. Slowly, the heavy steel shutters began to grind upward. The sound was like a choir of angels made of rusted gears. A blast of cold, sweet Chicago night air rushed into the lobby, clearing the nitrogen in a violent, swirling vortex. I slumped against the teller wall, my chest heaving, greedily gulping in the oxygen. It tasted like life. It tasted like a second chance. Through the rising shutters, I saw the flashing blue and red lights of the Chicago PD. Dozens of them. They hadn't just been called by the bank alarm. Ethan had been on the phone with dispatch the entire time he was ramming the doors. But as the police swarmed the lobby, I realized something. Margaret was gone. The hatch beneath the floorboards was still sealed from the inside. She hadn't just run. She'd used a pre-mapped route that led directly into the city's old freight tunnel system, a labyrinth of abandoned tracks that ran beneath the loop. I looked at Claire, who was currently being cuffed by 2 officers. She was silent now, her eyes fixed on the floor. Ryan Blackwood was being loaded onto a stretcher, his fake face half peeled away, looking like a discarded skin. "She's in the tunnels," I told the lead officer, a grizzly sergeant named Vance. "She's heading for the Union Station egress." "We've got units at every exit, Mr. Pierce," Vance said, his hand on my shoulder. "She's not going anywhere." But I knew Margaret. She wouldn't go for a public exit. She'd go for the one place I'd told her about years ago, a structural dead zone beneath the LaSalle Street Bridge, where the old foundations met the new steel. I looked at Ethan. He was standing by the SUV, his face covered in soot and glass, but his eyes were clear. "You okay, Dad?" "I'm alive, Ethan," I said, and for the first time in 3 years I stepped forward and pulled him into a hug. He was solid. He was real. He was the only part of the foundation that hadn't rotted. "Go with the paramedics," I whispered to him. "Tell them everything about the medication Claire gave me. I need to finish this." "Dad, no, let the police handle her. They don't know the bridge, Ethan," I said, pulling away. "I do." I didn't wait for permission. I slipped out the side employee entrance, disappearing into the cold Chicago night. I knew exactly where she was going, and I knew that in her hand, she still had the digital key to the offshore account, the $12 million that represented my father's life and my own future. What I didn't know was that Margaret wasn't just running. She was waiting. As I reached the dark, wet girders of the LaSalle Street Bridge, the sound of the river rushing beneath me, I heard a faint, rhythmic clack, clack, clack. The cane. She wasn't using it for support. She was tapping it against the steel. A signal. "I knew you'd come, Mitchell." Her voice floated out of the shadows beneath the bridge. "You always were so predictable. You just can't stand to see a structure with a flaw, can you?" I stepped into the shadows, the smell of damp concrete and river silt filling my nostrils. "The trust is dead, Margaret. The bank is swarming with feds. It's over." "Is it?" she asked, stepping into the dim light of a street lamp. She held up a small, sleek tablet. "The transfer is 99% complete. In 5 minutes the money hits a bank in the Cayman Islands that doesn't care about FBI injunctions. And I have the only biometric bypass." "You left your daughter to die," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. "Claire was a useful tool, but tools get dull, Mitchell. She got greedy. She started thinking she was the architect. She forgot that I'm the one who taught her how to lie." Margaret smiled, and in that moment, she looked truly beautiful and utterly terrifying. "I have a boat waiting a mile downriver. You can come with me, Mitchell. We can start over. No more sick beds. No more lies. Just us and $12 million. I looked at her, and then I looked at the bridge above us. I saw the hairline fracture I'd spotted years ago, the one I'd never reported because I was too busy taking her to appointments. "I didn't tell you the truth about this bridge, Maggie," I said, my voice calm. "What truth?" "It's not a structural dead zone," I said, stepping back. "It's a tension point, and you're standing right on the primary load-bearing rivet." I didn't know it yet, but I wasn't the only one who had a secret about the LaSalle Street Bridge. What happened next changed the ending of my story forever. Because, as Margaret took a step toward me, a third voice rang out from the darkness, a voice that shouldn't have been there. "She's right, Mitchell. You are predictable." I spun around. Standing there, holding a thermal-sealed briefcase and looking perfectly composed, was the one person I never suspected. My father's late attorney, the man who was supposed to have died 2 years ago. The man who held the true key to the legacy. The man standing in the shadows didn't look like a ghost. He looked like a masterpiece of expensive tailoring and cold-blooded patience. Arthur Sterling, my father's lead attorney for 40 years, the man who had supposedly suffered a fatal heart attack in a boardroom 2 years ago. I remembered the funeral. I remembered the closed casket, and the weeping widow he'd left behind. But as he stepped into the pale, sickly light of the LaSalle Street Bridge, Arthur didn't look like a man who had spent a single second in a grave. He looked like a man who had spent that time in a tanning bed in a gym. Arthur, the name came out of my mouth like a puff of smoke. I saw you buried. You saw a mahogany box and a well-managed PR campaign, Mitchell, Arthur said, his voice as smooth and dry as aged bourbon. He didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me like a structural flaw he'd finally decided to patch. Your father was a brilliant builder, but he was a paranoid man. He knew that as soon as he passed, the vultures would circle. He needed an executor who was beyond the reach of a subpoena. What's more out of reach than a dead man? Margaret moved then, but she didn't run. She walked right over to Arthur's side, her frailty now a distant, laughable memory. She stood beside him, her hand sliding familiarly into the crook of his arm. The humiliation didn't come as a sharp strike. It was a slow, agonizing realization. I had spent 7 years playing nurse to a woman who was having an affair with my father's dead lawyer. While I was measuring her blood pressure, they were measuring the size of the offshore accounts. While I was grieving my father, they were toast to his demise. Mitchell, don't look so shocked, Margaret said, her voice dripping with a cruel, mocking playfulness. Did you really think I'd spend my best years with a man who smells like W.D. Bone Mui and old blueprints? You were always so industrial, so predictable. You were the perfect cover. Nobody suspects the man who's too busy being a hero to notice his wife is glowing. I felt the ground tilt. The air beneath the bridge felt thick with the stench of river rot and a betrayal so deep it felt geological. The illness, the kidney failure. Arthur was the one who provided the doctors, wasn't he? Dr. Harrison is on my payroll, Mitchell, Arthur admitted with a dismissive shrug. He's a specialist in chronic management. We didn't want to kill you, Mitchell. We just needed you in a state of constant, low-level distraction. A man who is worried about his wife's vitals doesn't look too closely at the quarterly trust audits. You were the perfect firewall. I realized then that my father's legacy wasn't just the $12 million. The legacy was a complex web of shell companies and construction kickbacks my father had built over 50 years. Arthur and Margaret didn't just want the money, they needed my engineering seal to sign off on the structural safety of several aging properties they were planning to sell to the city for a massive, fraudulent profit. They weren't just stealing my past. They were planning to use my professional reputation to steal the city's future. The transfer is complete, Mitchell, Arthur said, holding up a small, blinking satellite uplink. The inheritance has moved, but we still need your seal. The physical one, the one you used to throw at poor Ryan. I gripped the heavy iron railing of the bridge. The cold metal bit into my palms. My mind, the part of me that was still an inspector, was frantically scanning the environment. I was outnumbered and outgunned. Arthur had a silent, muscular man hovering in the shadows behind him, a man who looked far more competent than Ryan Blackwood. I didn't know it yet, but the poison Claire had mentioned was finally reaching its peak in my system. My vision began to fray at the edges, the world turning into a jagged, impressionistic painting of gray and black. Give us the seal, Mitchell, Margaret said, stepping forward. And maybe we'll tell the paramedics where to find you before your heart gives out. Think of it as a final trade. Your dignity for your life. I looked at the river. The water was dark and churning, a chaotic force that didn't care about blueprints or betrayals. I built this bridge, I whispered, my voice sounding distant, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I know every rivet, every stress point. We don't care about the bridge, Mitchell, Margaret snapped, her patience finally snapping. Give me the seal. I reached into my pocket. My fingers were numb, fumbling against the cold steel of the dot stamp. I pulled it out, holding it over the dark water. You want the authority? I asked. Then go get it. I didn't throw it at them. I let it drop. The heavy block of steel disappeared into the black mouth of the Chicago River with a quiet final plunk. Margaret screamed, a high-pitched, jagged sound that echoed off the concrete pillars. Arthur's face transformed from a mask of calm into a contorted snarl of pure rage. You fool, Arthur hissed. That was your leverage. Without that seal, the city won't buy the properties, and the trust stays frozen for a decade of litigation. Exactly, I said, a dark euphoric satisfaction blooming in my chest despite the fading light in my eyes. If I'm going down, the bridge comes with me. Arthur nodded to the man in the shadows. Kill him. Make it look like a suicide, the grieving husband who finally snapped. The man stepped forward, a silenced pistol raised. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. I'd lost my career, my wife, my daughter, and now my life. I was a man whose structure had finally, completely failed. But then, the sound of a high-pitched, mechanical whine filled the air. A drone, a sleek, black industrial drone, dropped from the girders above, its camera lens glowing a menacing red. I wouldn't do that, Arthur. A voice boomed from the drone's speakers. It wasn't the digital ghost from the bank. It was a voice I recognized instantly. Ethan, I've been recording since you stepped under the bridge, Ethan said, his voice coming through the drone with a clarity that sliced through the night. And I'm not the only one watching. Look at the water, Arthur. Searchlights suddenly cut through the darkness, blinding and white. 3 police boats, their sirens silent, but their presence absolute, roared toward us from the bend in the river. Dad, stay down. Ethan's voice was a command. But as the police boats approached, Margaret did something I didn't expect. She didn't look at the boats. She didn't look at me. She looked at Arthur. You told me he was out of the picture, Arthur, she whispered, her voice trembling. You told me you had the son handled. Shut up, Margaret, Arthur growled, looking for an escape route. Margaret reached into her coat, her face twisted with a sudden, desperate realization. You were going to leave me too, weren't you? Just like Claire. The boat. It only has one seat. In the confusion of the approaching police and the hovering drone, the structural integrity of the conspiracy finally, totally dissolved. Margaret didn't aim for me. She lunged at Arthur, her hands clawing for the satellite uplink. They tumbled toward the edge of the embankment, a chaotic mess of silk and wool. Margaret, stop, I shouted, trying to move toward them. But my heart gave a sudden, violent lurch. My legs gave out, and I hit the cold, wet concrete. I watched in slow motion as they teetered on the edge of the river wall. The satellite uplink flew from Arthur's hand, skittering across the pavement toward me. Arthur reached for a support cable to steady himself, but his hand missed. He grabbed Margaret's shawl instead. I didn't know it yet, but the LaSalle Street Bridge was about to claim its final victims. As they fell into the dark, freezing water, the last thing I saw wasn't my wife's face. It was the blue light of the satellite uplink, sitting inches from my hand. The screen was still active. Transfer status, Jinmui Jinpersem. If I didn't hit cancel in the next 3 seconds, the $12 million would vanish forever into the ether, leaving me with nothing but the ruins of a life and a son who was still 300 yards away. But as my finger hovered over the screen, I saw a second notification pop up, a message from an unknown sender that made my heart stop. Mitchell, don't hit cancel. Look at the recipient's name. I looked. It wasn't an offshore account in the Caymans. The recipient was Ethan Pierce. My breath caught. My father hadn't trusted me. He'd bypassed me entirely. He'd left the legacy to the one person he knew would never be corrupted by the lies. But then why were Margaret and Arthur so sure they were getting the money? The realization hit me like a physical blow. The account was Ethan's, but the access was being diverted by a second, hidden logic bomb. If I hit cancel, I saved the money for Ethan. If I didn't, it went to Arthur's ghost. But there was a third option on the screen. A button I'd never seen before. FaceTime. Total reconstruction. I pressed it. The world went white. What happened next changed the history of the Pierce family forever. Because as the police dragged me from the embankment, I realized that FaceTime wasn't a program. It was a person. The white light didn't just fill the screen, it felt like it poured into my very veins, a cold, clinical surge of electricity that fought back against the sludge of the respiratory depressants. I felt my heart hitch, a violent, jagged thump against my ribs, and then the world rushed back in a deafening roar of sirens in the churning black water of the Chicago River. Hands were on me, strong, professional hands. Stay with us, Mr. Pierce. Breathe. Deep breaths. I gasped, my lungs expanding with a sharp metallic burn. I was lying on the wet concrete, the rain-slicked girders of the LaSalle Street Bridge towering over me like the ribs of a prehistoric beast. I turned my head, my vision still swimming in a soup of gray and blue. 50 yards out, a police spotlight sliced through the dark, illuminating two figures being hauled onto a rescue boat. Margaret and Arthur. They looked like drowned rats, their expensive clothes clinging to them like second skins of failure. The uplink. I wheezed, my hand clutching at the air. Where's the tablet? It's right here, Dad. I've got it. Ethan's face appeared in my field of vision. He looked older than he had 10 minutes ago, his eyes hard and focused. He was holding the satellite uplink, but he wasn't looking at the transfer status. He was staring at the name that had populated the screen when I hit FaceTime. I struggled to sit up, the paramedics trying to hold me down. Who is it, Ethan? Who is FaceTime? Ethan swallowed hard, his thumb tracing the edge of the screen. It's not a who, Dad, it's a where. And it's a name I haven't heard since I was 5 years old. He turned the screen toward me. In the center of the display, beneath a seal I recognized as my father's private construction firm logo, were the words, "The Elena Protocol." I felt a ghost of a memory stir in the back of my mind, a woman with kind eyes and hands that smelled of lavender and antiseptic. Elena. She hadn't been a nurse. She'd been my father's assistant for 30 years. The woman who had truly managed his life after my mother died. I'd been told she moved back to Italy a decade ago. She didn't leave, Mitchell, a voice said from the darkness behind the paramedics. I looked up. A woman was stepping out from the shadows of a parked police cruiser. She was in her late 60s, wearing a sharp navy trench coat. Her silver hair pulled back into a bun so tight it looked structural. It was Elena, but she didn't look like an assistant. She looked like an auditor from hell. Your father knew Arthur was a vulture, Elena said, her voice a low, steady hum that cut through the chaos of the police scene. And he knew Margaret was a parasite. He couldn't cut them out of the will without triggering a decade of lawsuits that would have drained the estate to zero. So he built a bridge with a hidden trapdoor. He waited for them to commit the crime of the century so he could bury them with the evidence. The paramedics finally got me onto a stretcher, but I refused to let them close the ambulance doors. I needed the truth. I needed to see the wreckage. He let me suffer for 7 years? I asked, a bitter, jagged edge to my voice. He let me brew the tea that was killing me? He didn't know about the poisoning, Mitchell, Elena said, stepping closer, her eyes softening for the first time. Nobody did. Arthur was too smart for that. But your father left me a specific set of instructions. When Mitchell hits the manual release, when the structure finally fails, give him the tools to rebuild. She reached into her coat and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound folder. The 12 million isn't the legacy, Mitchell. That was the bait. The real legacy is the forensic trail of 40 years of Arthur's racketeering. Everything he did to the city, everything he did to your father, and everything he did to you, it's all in here. And it's already been uploaded to the U.S. Attorney's office. I sank back into the padded cushion of the stretcher, the sheer weight of the reversal hitting me. I wasn't just a victim. I was the star witness in a demolition that was going to level the Chicago legal elite. I didn't know it yet, but the reconstruction wasn't going to be a quiet affair. A bridge doesn't just fall. It remembers every hand that tried to shake its foundations. The next 48 hours were a blur of sterile hospital rooms and sharp-faced federal agents. They had me on a detox drip to flush the respiratory depressants out of my system. Every hour, my mind felt sharper, the caregiver's fog evaporating to reveal the cold industrial steel of the man I used to be. Ethan never left my side. He sat in the corner with 3 laptops, his fingers flying over the keys. He was the digital demolition crew. While the feds were building the criminal case, Ethan was dismantling the offshore accounts Arthur and Margaret had used to hide their earlier thefts. Dad, Ethan said on the second night, his face illuminated by the blue glow of his screens. I found something. It's about Claire. I looked over at him, the mention of my daughter's name still feeling like a shard of glass in my chest. What about her? She wasn't just a puppet, Ethan said, pulling his chair closer to my bed. She was the one who recruited Ryan Blackwood. She'd been scouting him for 3 years. But here's the twist. She wasn't doing it for the money. She was doing it because Arthur told her you were the one who killed her grandfather. I froze. What? Arthur fed her a lie, Dad, Ethan whispered. He told her that you'd intentionally missed a structural flaw in one of my grandfather's sites 20 years ago to collect the insurance. He made you the villain in her story so she'd feel justified in erasing you. He didn't just steal our money, he stole our family's history. The level of psychological engineering Arthur had employed was breathtaking. He hadn't just built a heist, he'd built a cult of 3, with my wife and daughter as his primary converts. I felt a surge of rage so cold it felt like liquid nitrogen in my veins. "I want to see her," I said. "Claire, Dad, the feds have her in a holding cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. She's not talking." "She'll talk to me," I said, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. "I'm an inspector, Ethan. I know exactly where the pressure points are." 2 hours later, I was sitting in a windowless room that smelled of industrial bleach and old coffee. The heavy steel door buzzed open, and Claire was let in. She looked terrible. Her designer clothes were gone, replaced by a drab orange jumpsuit that made her skin look like parchment. She sat down, her hands cuffed to the table, and refused to look at me. "I know what Arthur told you, Claire," I said, my voice as steady as a concrete pylon. She flinched but didn't look up. "It doesn't matter now, does it? We're all in the wreckage." "It matters to the Foundation," I said. "Arthur lied to you. My father didn't die because of an insurance scam. He died because Arthur was skimming from the pension funds. And my father found out. Arthur didn't want a legacy. He wanted a cover-up. He used you to bury the only man who could have put him away. And then he used you to try and bury me." Claire finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "Why should I believe you? You spent 7 years being a ghost. You were so weak, Dad. You let her treat you like a dog." "I wasn't being weak, Claire," I said, leaning in so she could see the iron in my gaze. "I was being a husband. I was being a father. I was honoring a structure I thought was sound. But the inspection is over. The report is in. And the verdict is total demolition." I pushed a single piece of paper across the table. It was a copy of the Elena Protocol, the document proving Arthur had been the one who ordered the medication that was killing me. "He wasn't just using you for the money, Claire. He was using you to commit a slow-motion murder. If I had died in that bank, you would have been the one holding the syringe in the eyes of the law. He set you up to be the fall girl from day one." I watched the realization hit her. It was like watching a skyscraper imploded by a controlled blast. Her shoulders slumped, and a single, jagged sob escaped her throat. He said we'd be a family, in Buys, just us." "There was only ever one seat on that boat, Claire," I said, echoing her mother's words. "And you weren't in it." The silence that followed was a hammer. I stood up to leave, but Claire's voice stopped me at the door. "Dad?" I didn't turn around. "Yeah?" "Mom, she didn't just want the money, she hated the way you looked at her. Like she was something that needed to be fixed. She didn't want to be a structure, Dad. She wanted to be a fire." "Well," I said, my hand on the cold steel of the door handle. "She got her wish. Everything is ash now." I walked out of the prison and into the biting Chicago wind. I felt a strange, light-headed clarity. Rock bottom is a solid place to stand if you know how to build. But as I reached the parking lot where Ethan was waiting, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I answered, expecting another federal clerk. "Mitchell." The voice was a rasp, a dry, terrified whisper that sounded like it was coming from a place with no air. "Ryan, where are you?" "I'm in the freight tunnels, Mitchell." The imposter wheezed. They didn't catch me. I crawled out through the egress before the police could seal the second level. But I'm not alone down here. My blood turned to ice. "Who's with you?" "Margaret," Ryan gasped. She's not herself, Mitchell. She has the other tablet, the one with the remote access to the house. She's not running anymore. She's going back to the beginning." "What does that mean, Ryan?" "She said, if she can't have the legacy, she's going to make sure there's no Pierce family left to inherit anything. Mitchell, she's heading for the Elmwood house. And she has the master code for the gas lines." I didn't wait for him to finish. I dove into the car, shouting at Ethan to move. "The house. Ethan, the Elmwood house. She's going to blow the foundation." I didn't know it yet, but the reconstruction wasn't going to start with a new building. It was going to start with the total destruction of the old one. And I was the only one who knew how to stop the blast. What happened next changed the ending of my life. Because as we raced toward the suburbs, I realized that Facedown wasn't just about truth. It was about the one thing I'd forgotten to inspect. The second key, the one Margaret was currently holding, The tires of the SUV screamed as Ethan took the corner into the Elmwood district on two wheels. In the world of engineering, there is a concept called progressive collapse. It's what happens when one support fails, and the weight is transferred to the next, which then fails under the added load, creating a chain reaction that brings down the entire structure in seconds. As we tore through the quiet, suburban streets, I realized my life was in the final stage of a progressive collapse. The bridge was gone. The bank was a crime scene. And now, the house, the very place where I had played the fool for 7 years, was about to become a funeral pyre. "How did she get away, Dad?" Ethan shouted over the roar of the engine. "The feds said they had them on the boat." "She's a master of the pivot, Ethan," I said, my voice tight. "She probably faked a seizure or a heart attack the second they got her on deck." In the chaos of the river rescue, with Arthur in cuffs and the water freezing, a dying woman is the last person they'd watch closely. She didn't jump into the river to escape. She jumped because she knew the freight tunnels had an intake vent right at the waterline. I checked the tablet. The phase TAM screen had shifted. It was no longer a blue light of hope. It was a pulsing red map of the Elmwood house's smart home grid. Margaret was logged in via a remote proxy. She wasn't just turning on the gas. She was overriding the safety sensors, locking the windows, and disabling the fire suppression system I'd spent $6,000 installing 3 years ago. "She's not just blowing the house," I whispered, the realization hitting me with the force of a wrecking ball. "She's destroying the second key." "What is the second key, Dad?" "You keep saying that. The Elena protocol wasn't just about Arthur's crimes." "Ethan," I said, my mind racing through the fragments of the files I'd seen. "Elena was the coordinator for a surrogacy contract. Your mother and I. Back in Haingin La Muitam. Before the symptoms started, we signed the papers. We wanted another child. But then the world went sideways. I thought the contract was canceled. I thought the clinic had refunded us." I looked at the screen, where a hidden directory was finally decrypting. "She didn't cancel it, Ethan. She hijacked it. She used the Phase Bay funds to keep the surrogacy active in secret. There's a child. A girl. Emma." Ethan nearly swerved into a parked car. "A sister? I have a sister? She's 14 months old, Ethan. And Margaret doesn't want her because she loves her. She wants her because Emma is the only thing that can legally unlock the secondary trust, a $50 million fund my father set up specifically for the next generation of Pierces. Margaret can't get to that money without the child's biometric signature, and she can't get the child without destroying the evidence of her own fraud. The second key wasn't a piece of metal. It was a birth certificate and a DNA profile hidden in a fireproof safe behind the HVAC panel in the basement, the one place Margaret was currently flooding with natural gas. We skidded to a halt in front of the house. It looked peaceful from the outside. The porch light I'd meticulously replaced a month ago casting a warm, deceptive glow. But as I stepped out of the truck, the smell hit me. Natural gas. It was thick enough to taste. A sweet, heavy rot in the evening air. "Stay back, Ethan," I commanded. "If a single spark hits this atmosphere, the whole block goes." "Dad, you can't go in there alone, your heart." "I know the vents, Ethan. I know where the manual shutoff is." I didn't wait. I took a deep breath of the relatively clean air near the curb and ran for the front door. I didn't use my keys. I knew the door would be dead-bolted and reinforced from the inside. Instead, I ran for the garage. I designed the support beams myself. I knew the third panel on the left was the weakest point in the frame. I grabbed the heavy sledgehammer from the back of the truck and swung. Crack! The wood splintered. I swung again. Boom! I crawled through the gap into the darkened garage. The air here was shimmering with gas. I could feel the pressure in my ears. I moved with the muscle memory of a man who had maintained this structure for 7 years. I didn't turn on a light. I didn't even use a flashlight. The risk of a spark in the switch was too high. I moved by touch, my hands sliding along the familiar cold copper of the pipes. I reached the basement stairs. The smell was overpowering now. I felt the first signs of the gas affecting my brain, a strange, slow-motion euphoria, a tingling in my fingertips. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. Thump, thump, skip. "Mitchell." The voice came from the bottom of the stairs. It wasn't the voice of a dying woman. It was the voice of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. I looked down. Margaret was standing at the base of the furnace, holding a vintage Zippo lighter, my father's lighter. She looked radiant in the dim light, her eyes bright with a madness that was finally, fully out in the open. She wasn't holding a cane. She was holding the heavy, fireproof safe I'd hidden years ago. "You always were so obsessed with foundations, Mitchell," she said, her voice smooth and chillingly calm. "But you forgot that some things are meant to burn." "The girl, Margaret," I rasped, my lungs screaming for oxygen. "Where is Emma?" "She's with a nurturing associate of Arthur's in a safe house in Indiana," Margaret said, her thumb flicking the flint of the lighter. "Scritch, scritch. As soon as this house goes, the records of her birth will be destroyed. I'll present a new set of papers. I'll be the grieving widow and the devoted mother of the new Pierce heir. I'll have the 50 million, and I'll have the legacy." "You're a monster," I said, stepping down the first stair. "I'm an opportunist, Mitchell. You taught me that. You showed me how easy it is to manipulate a man who thinks his only job is to provide." "I didn't just provide, Margaret," I said, my hand sliding behind the stair rail to the emergency gas bypass I'd installed during the Hang In Lea Heimwemote renovation, a detail I'd never shared with her. I inspected, and I found the flaw. "What flaw?" she hissed, her thumb pausing on the lighter. "You," I said. "You think you're the architect, but you're just the scrap metal." I pulled the bypass. The sound was a violent metallic thunk that vibrated through the entire house. The rush of gas into the basement didn't just stop. The system went into a high-pressure reverse purge, sucking the atmosphere out of the room and venting it through the chimney at 100 miles an hour. The vacuum effect was so strong it nearly pulled Margaret off her feet. The lighter flew from her hand, the flame extinguishing instantly in the rush of air. "What did you do?" she screamed, her voice lost in the roar of the ventilation. "I redesigned the exit strategy, Margaret," I shouted, moving down the stairs with a strength I didn't know I had left. I reached the bottom and tackled her. We hit the concrete floor hard, the safe clattering away into the shadows. She fought like a wild animal, her fingernails clawing at my face, her teeth bared. She wasn't a wife, she was a parasite fighting for its host. But I was an inspector, and I knew exactly how to dismantle a failing structure. I pinned her arms, my weight holding her down. The air in the basement was clearing, the sweet smell of gas replaced by the cold, sharp scent of the night air being pulled in through the garage. "It's over, Maggie," I whispered, my face inches from hers. "The feds are already at the safe house in Indiana. Ethan found the GPS coordinates on the uplink 10 minutes ago. Emma is safe. The second key is already in the hands of the U.S. attorney." The fight went out of her all at once. Her body went limp, and for a second the mask of the predator slipped, revealing the terrified, hollowed-out woman beneath. "Mitchell, please," she sobbed, the tears looking real for the first time in 7 years. "I did it for us, for our future." "There was only ever one seat on that boat, Margaret," I said, quoting the lie she'd told Claire. "And you're not in it." I stood up, dragging her with me as the sound of sirens filled the driveway. Ethan burst into the basement, followed by a team of FBI agents in tactical gear. They moved like shadows, stripping the room of its secrets in seconds. As they led Margaret away in cuffs, she looked back at me. She didn't scream this time. She didn't cry. She just looked at the house, the structure she had spent 7 years turning into a prison, and whispered something I didn't hear. I stood in the center of the basement, my heart finally finding a steady, rhythmic beat. The house was standing. The legacy was safe. But as I looked at the empty space where the furnace used to be, I realized the most important truth of all. A bridge doesn't just hold things up. It connects two places. And for 7 years, I'd been standing in the middle, afraid to cross. "Dad?" Ethan walked over, his hand on my shoulder. "We got the call. Emma's okay. She's with the child services team in Gary. We can go see her now." I looked at my son, the one part of the foundation I hadn't managed to destroy. "Let's go, Ethan. Let's go meet your sister." We walked out of the house and into the cool, clear night. I didn't look back at the Elmwood house. It was just wood and stone. It wasn't my home anymore. But as I reached the truck, Agent Miller intercepted me. He looked grim, his face illuminated by the flashing blue lights. "We found something in the safe, Mitchell," Miller said, holding a small blood-stained ledger. "Something that wasn't in the Elena protocol." I froze. "What?" Margaret wasn't just working with Arthur, Miller said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The ledger shows payments to a second entity, someone who has been inside your DOT office for years, someone who is making sure your inspections never found the real cracks in Arthur's properties. I felt a new kind of cold settle into my marrow. The betrayal didn't end with my family. It went all the way back to the job I loved. Who is it, Miller? Miller opened the ledger to the last page. My eyes scanned the name, and the world tilted again. What happened next changed the nature of my revenge. Because the name on the ledger wasn't a stranger. It was the man who had given me my first job. The man I considered a second father. And he was currently standing 3 feet behind me, holding a gun to Ethan's head. The sound of a gun's hammer cocking is a very specific frequency. In a silent room, it's a sharp mechanical click. But in the middle of a driveway swarmed by federal agents, amidst the blue and red strobes of police cruisers, it sounded like the final rivet snapping on a condemned bridge. It was the sound of a total structural failure. I didn't turn around immediately. I didn't have to. The shadow that stretched across the wet asphalt, cast by the floodlights behind us, belonged to a man I had looked up to for 30 years. Jim Halloway, the former director of the DOT, the man who had handed me my first inspection kit when I was a jittery 22-year-old, the man who had stood by me at my father's funeral and told me I was the finest engineer he'd ever known. "Drop the ledger, Mitchell," Jim said. His voice wasn't the booming, authoritative baritone I'd heard in boardroom meetings. It was a thin, desperate rasp, the sound of a man who had realized he was the last support pillar standing in a demolition zone. I felt a coldness in my chest that had nothing to do with the night air or the gas lingering in my lungs. I looked at Ethan. My son's face was a mask of pure, defiant terror. The barrel of Jim's service pistol was pressed firmly against Ethan's temple. This was the man who had supposedly pityingly accepted my resignation 3 years ago, the man who had called me a hero for taking care of Margaret. Now the hero was looking at the architect of the rot. "You were the one, Jim," I said, my voice sounding like grinding stone. "Arthur was the muscle, Margaret was the distraction, but you were the permit. You were the one signing off on the hairline fractures. You were the one making sure the city never looked at the foundations of Arthur's developments." "I was making sure the city kept moving, Mitchell," Jim hissed. He stepped closer, using Ethan as a human shield. The FBI agents had their weapons drawn, a semicircle of death surrounding us, but nobody dared to fire. "Do you have any idea how much it costs to keep a city like Chicago from falling into the lake? Your father knew. He understood that sometimes you have to grease the gears to keep the bridge from groaning. But you were always too damn honest. You were an anomaly in the design. So you groomed me," I whispered. The realization was a sickening weight. "You didn't hire me because I was the best. You hired me because you knew my integrity would make the perfect cover. If Mitchell Pierce says the bridge is safe, nobody asks questions. And when I started getting too close to the truth 10 years ago, you didn't fire me. You helped Arthur and Margaret build a cage for me." "It was a comfortable cage, Mitchell," Jim shouted, his eyes darting frantically toward the federal agents. "You gotta be the noble martyr. You gotta be the saintly husband. All you had to do was stop looking at the ledgers and start looking at the pill bottles." I looked at the ledger in my hand, the one Agent Miller had just pulled from the safe. It wasn't just a list of payments. It was a record of 30 years of systematic corruption. Jim Halloway hadn't just been a silent partner. He was the primary beneficiary. He was the one who had facilitated the accidental death of my father when the old man started to grow a conscience. "Dad, don't give it to him," Ethan wheezed, his voice straining against the pressure of the gun. "He's not leaving this driveway." "Shut up, kid," Jim snarled. He looked at me, the madness of a cornered predator finally fully visible. "The second key, Mitchell. I know it's in that safe. The surrogacy papers, the DNA links, with everything that connects the Pierce legacy to the next generation. If I burn that safe and take this ledger, there is no case. I can walk. I have the exits mapped." I looked at the house. The garage was still venting. The high-pressure purge I'd triggered hummed like a distant jet engine. I looked at the dot seal, still heavy in my pocket. And then, I looked at the gas main I'd bypassed. Have you ever noticed that the most dangerous part of a bridge isn't the part that breaks, but the part that stays rigid while everything else moves? "You want the legacy, Jim?" I asked. I started walking toward him, my steps slow and deliberate. "Stay back, I'll kill him, Mitchell, I swear to God." "No, you won't," I said. "Because if you kill him, you have no leverage. And if you have no leverage, the agents behind me will turn you into a sieve before you can take another breath. You're an engineer, Jim. Calculate the odds." I kept walking. I could feel the caregiver's fog lifting entirely, replaced by the cold, industrial clarity that had defined my best years. I wasn't the grieving husband. I wasn't the poison victim. I was the senior inspector. "The house is still purging, Jim," I said, my voice a low, terrifying hum. "The gas is being sucked out through the chimney, but there's a pocket of it trapped in the attic crawl space, right above where you're standing. I designed the ventilation myself. It's a dead zone." Jim's eyes flickered upward for a fraction of a second. It was all the progressive collapse I needed. I didn't reach for a gun. I reached for the heavy steel dot seal in my pocket and hurled it at the garage's emergency manual override, a lever I'd left exposed when I smashed my way in. The seal hit the lever with a metallic clang. The high-pressure purge didn't just stop, it reversed. A sudden, violent backdraft of remaining gas and air slammed through the vents. At the same moment, the spark from the furnace, the one Margaret had tried to ignite, finally found a trail. It wasn't a massive explosion, it was a structural burp, a localized concussive wave that blew the attic windows out and sent a cloud of soot and debris raining down on the driveway. Jim flinched, the sound and the pressure wave knocking his aim off by a fraction of an inch. In that heartbeat I lunged. I didn't hit Jim. I grabbed Ethan and tackled him to the pavement. The FBI agents didn't miss their window. A single, muffled pop echoed through the driveway, a sharpshooter's round from a rooftop across the street. Jim Halloway didn't scream. He simply folded, the gun clattering onto the asphalt as he hit the ground. The man who had been my second father, the man who had tried to erase my existence, was neutralized in the very driveway he had helped turn into a crime scene. Silence returned to the Elmwood district, broken only by the hiss of the rain and the distant, fading wail of sirens. I lay on the wet ground, holding Ethan's head to my chest, my heart beating a slow, steady, victorious rhythm. "It's over, Ethan," I whispered. "The bridge is down. We're safe." 3 weeks later, the world felt fundamentally different. I stood in the lobby of the Department of Children and Families in Gary, Indiana. The air here didn't smell like gas or rubbing alcohol. It smelled of floor wax and cheap coffee. It was the most beautiful scent I'd ever encountered. Agent Miller stood beside me, his face surprisingly human for the first time. "Arthur Sterling and Jim Halloway are facing life without parole, Mitchell." The Elena protocol held up. "Every property they tried to flip has been seized. The legacy is yours, all of it. The $12 million from the trust and the $50 million from the Generation Fund." I didn't look at him. I was staring at the door at the end of the hallway. "I don't want the money, Miller. I want the girl." "You've got her," Miller said, handing me a final set of papers. The DNA results came back. "You're a Chinmui% match. Margaret may have hijacked the contract, but she couldn't change the biology. Emma is your daughter." The door opened, and a caseworker stepped out, carrying a bundle wrapped in a bright yellow blanket. Emma was 14 months old, with a tuft of dark hair and steady, curious eyes that held the exact same shade of storm cloud gray as mine. As she was placed in my arms, the weight of her felt like a cornerstone being set in a new foundation. She didn't cry. She just reached up and grabbed my thumb with a grip that felt like iron. "Hey there, kiddo," I whispered, my voice breaking for the first time in this entire ordeal. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find you. I was lost in the construction." Ethan walked up beside me, his hand on my shoulder. He looked at his sister, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through the years of bitterness. "She looks like you, Dad, poor kid." I laughed, a real, deep laugh that felt like it was clearing the last of the poison from my soul. We left the city that afternoon, the Chicago skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror. I'd sold the Elmwood house to an anonymous trust, a group I'd vetted to ensure no ghost of Arthur or Jim could ever touch it again. We were heading south, toward the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. I'd purchased a small cabin near Asheville, a place with solid foundations and no smart home overrides. A place where the only thing I had to inspect was the growth of the garden and the height of my daughter. As I drove, I thought about the dad revenge everyone expected me to take. They expected me to be bitter, to spend the rest of my life hunting down the remnants of the people who hurt me. But they didn't understand the heart of an engineer. Revenge isn't about blood. It's about restoration. The real revenge was reclaiming my son. The real revenge was meeting my daughter. The real revenge was realizing that while they had stolen 7 years of my life, they had failed to steal the man I was. I looked at the vintage gold watch on my wrist, the one I'd taken back from Ryan Blackwood. It was ticking perfectly, a rhythmic reminder that time only moves forward. When people ask me about the family revenge story that made the headlines, I tell them the same thing. Never ignore the small cracks in the foundation of trust. They rarely stay small. But remember, this strength isn't found in the destruction. It's found in what you choose to build on the ruins. I'm Mitchell Pierce. I spent 30 years inspecting bridges, but I've spent the last year building the only one that ever mattered, the one that leads home. As the sun dipped below the mountains, casting a long golden light over the road ahead, I reached over and squeezed Ethan's hand. In the back seat, Emma let out a soft, sleepy sigh. The structure was sound. The inspection was complete. And for the first time in a decade, I wasn't a ghost. I was a father. And that was all the legacy I ever needed.